Now, there was a woman in this mix. So far, a lot of these people are American or European white men. But there was a woman named Mary Parker Follett who stands out. Not many people know about her, but she was one of the very first people to get interested in group theory. This is around the turn of the century. She was also the one who began to look at conflict resolution. She took conflict and saw it going on and named it as something to be concerned about. She was one of the very first people to take a look at empowerment, and one of the very first people to take the role of the leader in a group and begin to examine it, and got curious about what's the impact that the leader's behavior will have on the group. This is something that will come back very powerfully in the next segment. Erik Erikson. Very simple, significant contribution to the field of OD. It was Erikson who really came up with the notion that human beings go through fairly predictable stages of development through their lifetime. They go through infancy and the toddler stage and the school stage and middle age and late adult life, and that each one of those stages has certain kind of psychological qualities or agendas that are being worked on during that phase. So anything that we do today in OD that has a kind of a developmental concept, like even the notion that a group goes through, forming, norming, storming, and performing, all those things can trace their roots back to Erikson, who was one of the first people to kind of name that. Then another one is Abraham Maslow. Probably everyone in here has heard of Maslow's triangle, his hierarchy of needs. Maslow was very interested in what motivates people. And he's the one who figured out that an unmet need continues to motivate, but that a met need does not motivate anymore. So at the bottom of his hierarchy, you have physical needs like shelter and food and so forth, and it works its way all the way up through to the very top, which is kind of personal development. But the interesting thing I want to share with you here is that Maslow had this concept of, as a psychologist, why are we always looking at sick people? Why are we always trying to learn about psychology from looking at people that are neurotic or that are having problems? What could we discover if we looked at well people? What a concept. Let's look at people that seem to have it together and figure out what we can learn from them. He called it Eupsychian therapy, or Eupsychian. He applied it to organizations. Eupsychian management. Let's see if we can figure out what kind of people seem to do really, really well. I think it's the precursor to appreciative inquiry. The next two people who are the most important contributors in most recent time would be Carl Rogers and Eric Berne. Let's talk about Carl Rogers first. He looked at analytical psychology, like especially Freud, and then behavioral psychology, like Skinner. And he said, you know what, there's a third, it was called third force or humanistic psychology. He said neither of those two really take the whole person and look at the whole person. Jung was kind of getting at that, but Rogers was the first one who came up with the notion that we need to look at human beings as whole characters. He figured out that in therapy, when a client is sitting with a therapist, that the quality of the relationship between the helper, between the therapist and the person was extremely important. That relationship was the highway or the vehicle which really, in many ways, determined the quality of the therapy that was happening. So he called it client-centered therapy. Up to then, a lot of the therapy had been based on the therapist, in a sense, gathering data from the client, getting information from the client, and the therapist figuring everything out, and then somehow trying to get the client to hear it or understand it or learn it. Rogers said, no, let's do therapy so that the client is the one who's getting the insights. Very, very interesting shift that's taken place. He's the first one to popularize the notion of self-esteem and actually personal growth. The whole personal growth movement, which has a very significant step toward OD, as we'll see in a minute, came from Rogers. But Eric Berne made a huge book. I know in the early 70s when I discovered this book, it was like my life changed. It was called I'm Okay, You're Okay. Maybe you've heard of it. It was about transactional analysis. Eric Berne was a therapist who said we need to give therapy away to the people. We need to give counseling, give the principles away, teach our clients the principles of psychology so that they can take care of themselves. instead of it having only residing over here in the expert. He came up with this concept of life scripts, that we're all living out a kind of a life script that we inherited or we created when we were very young, and that everything that happens as we get older can be seen as a reflection of that life script. And he wanted to help people change their life script or change their story. He's the one who said that self-esteem and personal growth depend on how the person inside handles these three characters. We have living inside of us a parent, you have a critical parent and a nurturing parent, and a child, in a sense, in our tummy, what wants something. So we have the natural child and we have the adaptive child that's trying to please the parent. And then in between the two, we have this adult, actually, that lives in the mind, that's trying to make decisions about what to do between these two characters. Remember Freud, remember? Superego, the id, and the ego. Here's Eric Berne coming back now to Freud's basic theory, only making it very, very practical. Eric Berne said, let's give this away to the people. Let's teach them the principles, the parent, adult, child, and so forth. Berne was actually the originator of the term self-help. That's such a huge thing now. The sections in the bookstores, on the internet, the whole field of self-help can be traced back to Eric Berne, and I think also to Carl Rogers. These 8 people that I've just talked to you about came from the psychology side of things. Their contribution to the field of OD is right there for us to see if we look for it. Then the next group of people, what I call the 4 giants, the 4 really big heavy-duty people in OD, were taking these same kind of principles, only looking at organizations. But we had to understand that where OD came from had its roots in a very special linkage back through the field of psychology. Now let's take a look at the 4 giants.